Thank you all for logging in today and welcome to our webinar on shrinking spaces for criticism of Israel in Germany. In this webinar, we want to hear from international experts on German engagement with criticism of Israel to discuss the context and practice of the limitations on criticism and to think together about possible ways forward. The webinar is organized by the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions and the Haifa Center for German and European Studies. I'm Guy Shalev, a postdoctoral fellow at the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions at Haifa University. And we will have today a few speakers. We'll start with an introduction by Katarina Konarek, who is the director of the Haifa Center for German and European Studies. She'll provide a short introduction on the context of this discussion. We'll then have four experts on the subject. We'll start with Dr. Stefan Hagemann, who is a professor at the University of Kaiserslautern and the former director of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung in Israel. We'll then move on to Dr. Katarina Gallo, or Kati, to make sure we're not mixing between the Katarinas, a professor at Brown University and the co-author with Professor Saida Chan of the book Israelis, Palestinians, and Germans in Berlin, Stories of a Complex Relationship. We'll then move on to Yossi Bartal, who is the co-director of an organization called Diaspora Alliance. Yossi will tell us a little bit more about the organization, I hope, later. And Riyad Othman, who is the Near East advisor at Medico International. So thank you again all for coming, and I'm giving the microphone to Katarina to start the introduction.
So thank you, Guy. Also from my side, a very warm welcome. I see a lot of people taking part in this webinar, and this makes me also personally very happy. It shows us also that we chose probably the right time. When Guy and me were thinking about this webinar, it was about half a year ago. It was when the new Israeli government came into power. We had in mind that we really need to discuss something. But we know by today that what we wanted to discuss gained really a momentum and a big more relevance than it was maybe half a year ago. Especially today when Benjamin Netanyahu is in Berlin, was able to travel to Berlin, we also have to say. So what I would like to do as a short intro to all of us is to go over what happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks, because I think it's very symbolic and it gives us an idea about this special relationship that we want to focus on, the relationship between Germany and Israel. And one big question, especially for me as a political scientist, is what is this relation about? Is it a relation that concerns foreign policy, or is it not much more in Germany a domestic debate? Aren't we like talking a very domestic issue, like this special relationship? And also, what does this mean to be in this special relationship, to be in this special friendship? So before we start with our great panelists, who I also would like to thank that you are with us today, let me guide you through what happened in the last week, so we are all up to date. And I would like to start, I have it here on the slide, with a kind of outstanding op-ed that was written by Thomas Dutton-Dreyfus, published just last week in the Berliner Zeitung. Because normally, especially German media is very, very reluctant in any kind of criticism towards Israel. We figured this out over the last years. But here we have a very forward pushing comment saying also this is a comment about cowardly in German, Feigheit, saying Israel is burning and Germany is just watching. In his op-ed, he is focusing on the current demonstrations that are going on in Israel since weeks against the government, against an extremely right fascist government that is trying to deconstruct the separation of power in Israel through what they call reforms, or what maybe Thomas would call more like a putsch. And he's also in the first lines already saying violence is escalating. not just in the demonstrations, but also in the occupied Palestinian territories. And Germany is just silent. We need to stop this. This is kind of what he's asking for. Currently, what is happening on a political level is this kind of pictures that we are very used to. German and Israeli politicians are still shaking hands. You can see the first picture shows the German Minister of Justice, Marco Buschmann, meeting his counterpart, Yariv Levin, in Jerusalem. Buschmann was there to open an exhibition in Tel Aviv University, and also in this framework visited his counterpart. Buschmann doesn't look very happy, but still they are shaking hands, still they are meeting. And Buschmann traveled in a time where the German government explicitly said that they wouldn't like any German minister currently visiting Israel, being in closer touch with any of the Israeli government representatives in order to be sensitive to this situation. Buschmann didn't care a lot about it. It led also to frictions between him and the foreign minister, the German foreign minister. He went to Jerusalem. He talked with Yariv Levin. He, of course, mentioned, and he said it also in a public press statement, that he is concerned about what's going on, but this was it. So there's no more consequences, and there's still the option for him to travel, to meet, and to, again, have this picture where they are shaking hands. The second picture below shows the current Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, the German one, and the counterpart, Eli Cohen, while they're meeting in Berlin. This meeting happened on March 1st. And this is also very crucial because it happened just a couple of days after Huwara. So let me show you what we're talking about when we're talking about Huwara. Huwara is a Palestinian village of about 5,000 inhabitants in the occupied Palestinian territories. Most of Huwara is located in Area C, which is a restricted Israeli military zone, and the other part is in Area B, which is basically under the rule of the Israeli army. This town is located south of Nablus and located on the so-called Route 60. It's a street that leads through the occupied Palestinian territories and is mainly used by settlers. And this was an attack that happened on this village, conducted by over 100 of settlers. We have here also a short tweet about it, which can be declared as a pogrom while the Israeli military was watching, and ambulance cars and fire trucks didn't have the ability to reach to this place. It left almost 100 people injured, one Palestinian man killed, and this all happened under the eyes of the current Israeli government. The Israeli Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, said even in the aftermath, this village of Huwara should be deleted. It should be wiped out. And after these pictures that are circulated, also, of course, in the German press, this is why I'm clicking back to this picture, Annalena Baerbock met Eli Cohen. She mentioned, of course, what happened in Huwara and that she condemns it, but it didn't have any further consequences for them. So this is where we're currently standing, and this is why we are holding also this webinar with our experts in order to go a bit deeper and try to understand what are these spaces left for criticism of Israel in Germany? How is the German public dealing with it? How are NGOs affected by this, the work of NGOs? What is the general political outline? And again, what are also the German people themselves thinking about it? So I'm very happy now to hand over back to Guy, and I'm very much looking forward for the discussion. So thank you, everyone, and I wish us all a very good webinar.
Thank you, Katharina. So we ask each of our speakers to speak very shortly, short presentations about their perspective on this question. Afterwards, we'll have some questions for the panel, and then we'll open the stage for questions from the audience. So we'll start, as we said, with Dr. Steffen Hagemann.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and welcome from Haifa. So I'm lucky to be at Haifa at the moment, and also to get some of the atmosphere here, some experiences, some impressions of the demonstration, and really the tense political situation in Israel. I can really continue Katharina's presentation started talking about the special relationship, and I want to give a little bit of background on this special characteristic or the uniqueness of this relationship. And the uniqueness, of course, is related to the memory of the Holocaust and the commitment of Germany that Germany consequently made to Israel's existence and security. And from that perspective, Israel is perceived in Germany very much as the legal and also moral representative of Jews victimized by the Nazi regime. And this sets apart this relationship from other bilateral relationships. So there is historical sensitivity, there is historical empathy towards Israel. But as Katharina also indicated, this special relationship is also a domestic issue. It also serves some kind of identity need, or in political science, we sometimes call it ontological security of a state, because relations with Israel and support for Israel was and is an important pillar upon which a post-World War II Germany was rebuilt and accepted also back into a world community. So it is the new democratic, good, moral Germany that was to be accepted again. And this becomes also very clear if we look back at the beginning of this relationship, Luxembourg Accords. And at that time, we already see a very complex relationship between latent anti-Semitism at the time, attempts at deflecting German guilt, and also philo-Semitism. And this mixture continues partly until today. But it was also clear in the discussions that for the German government, like relations with Israel were very important, an external validation of this new German identity as a democracy. And so this special relationship provides Germany with legitimacy and also international reputation. And this contribution, this is something that only Israel can give to Germany, this contribution has been recognized and valued by German politicians. And if you look at the speeches until today, this is mentioned in all the visits. And this special relationship with Israel has been met in recent years with near universal approval among the political class in Germany. Although Katharina mentioned that, I would say there's a huge gap between the political class and the German public. And maybe we can continue speaking about that later. And of course, the special relationship had to be maintained over time, and it needs certain practices to maintain this relationship. And so you have these symbolic reaffirmations. Katharina, you showed some pictures. We have public commitments to the relationship. We have frequent visits of delegations. You have speeches of the chancellor and presidents in the respective parliaments, cabinet level consultations. So there's really a network on the political level, but also civil society level. You have a real network of organizations that have a very important voice in the public debate, and also who have a lot of financial resources. So this is also, I think, an important topic. Another point that I think is important is that this relationship is an asymmetric relationship. And historical research also clearly shows that Israeli decision makers also in the past were quite aware that this discourse of a special relationship gives Israel leverage towards Germany. And you can see that in many examples throughout the history of this relationship, that you have Israeli reminders also on the moral debt to Israel when German representatives challenge the foundations of this special relationship. And so there's a mechanism also coming with the special relationship that can be maybe described as a kind of reflexive marginalization of voices in the German discourse that challenge the foundations of this relationship. But that, of course, doesn't mean that there have not been conflicts in the history between Germany and Israel. There have been, and openly discussed. There were conflicts of interest. Germany has and had economic interests in the Arab world, so there have been conflicts. And there are also normative disagreements between Germany and Israel regarding the use of force, international law, international institutions. But in many cases, if you had like normative disagreements, the responsibility for the special relationship was prioritized. And you could see it recently again when Germany voted in the United Nations against a resolution requesting an advisory opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli annexation, and the legal status of the occupation. So on the one hand, Germany commits itself to international law, and then it votes against such resolutions. So there is a tension between these commitments. And I think there are two arguments used in Germany to help balance this tension between support for Israel and the other normative commitments. And one is that Israel is always referred to as a liberal democracy, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, which allows identification and also a basis of shared values despite disagreements. And the second part is support for the two-state solution you have in Germany, which comes with various assumptions, such as that this is a territorial conflict with two more or less equal participants, that the occupation is a temporary condition, that Israel is committed to the idea of the two-state solutions, and that both sides have to compromise to find a resolution of the conflict. And this basic understanding very much limits the way the conflict and Israel is also discussed in Germany. And we see, for example, this regarding the term apartheid and the analysis that is coming with it. Maybe we can discuss that later again. But I think this discourse is increasingly challenged. I mean, we see now that this government is threatening the foundations of democracy in Israel. We see not only a continuation of a one-state reality with unequal rights, but we have a government who clearly says the intention is to annex, and steps are taken. And this, in a way, challenges this kind of ritualized solidarity with Israel. And now with the visit of Benjamin Netanyahu, we see that many Israelis, but also Israelis in Germany, and Yossi, and you will probably speak about that, and other groups. We have this letter that were mentioned by the New Israel Fund that demand that Germany should not just have a kind of idealized view of Israel that serves its own interest, but should take a hard look at reality. And it should also be aware that Netanyahu and Netanyahu's visits to various European countries is a way in which he seeks legitimacy. And so international reactions do matter. And coming to Berlin and meeting Scholz, that does matter. So I think there are challenges to this discourse, which also gives us some opportunities. And we will follow up on that later. So I stop here for now and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Stefan Hagemann. And you mentioned briefly the implications on Israelis living in Germany. And we're moving on to Dr. Kati Galor, who has done research on Israelis and Palestinians in Berlin.
It's a pleasure and honor to participate in this roundtable discussion. And I'm very grateful to you, Guy, and to Katharina for your invitation and for taking this initiative to organize this event. I believe indeed that it is both timely and important. So, and I'm glad to briefly summarize my co-authored book with my Palestinian colleague, Saeda Chan. You mentioned the book, you translated actually the German title into English. In English, the title would be The Moral Triangle, Germans, Israelis, Palestinians. In the English version, we don't specify in the title that it's Berlin, because for the Anglo-American public, it would be too broad, too narrow a subject. But for the German reader, it is clear that Berlin holds a very unique position in the context of Israeli and Palestinian communities in Germany. So just to briefly summarize what we did in this book, we prepared it with a field study that we conducted in 2018, which was based on some 100 informal and semi-formal interviews with roughly 1/3 Germans, 1/3 Palestinians, and 1/3 Israelis living in the city of Berlin. And beyond reading the relevant scholarship and also media coverage in 4 different languages, German, Hebrew, Arabic, and English, that is, we didn't just wildly read all the media coverage, but of course the media coverage that was related directly to the topics we were going to analyze. And so we did this as a preparation over the course of roughly 2 years. And we also participated in various events and visited and analyzed a large number of institutions and events connected to these communities. And the key issue we really focused on in this study was the question of Germans and Germany's moral responsibility towards Israelis and Palestinians in Berlin, in Germany, but also those who live in the Middle East, and also Germans' accountability with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in light of the Holocaust, in light of the Nakba, and also considering both past and current injustices and human rights violations as they relate directly or indirectly to Israelis and Palestinians. So just a couple of words on our positionalities. So Saed Achan grew up in the West Bank under Israeli military occupation, and then pursued his university education in the US. And this is where he has been a professor. We met at Brown University while Saed was a postdoctoral student in the Watson Institute for International Studies, and the anthropology department actually was shortly after I returned from Israel, where I spent from Jerusalem, where I spent the beginning weeks of the Gaza war. I'm the daughter of Holocaust survivor, and I grew up in Germany and became an Israeli citizen at the age of 21, and have devoted much of my career, most of the last 30 plus years, working on Israel, Israelis, Israeli culture, and also the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. And so for me, this study we conducted in Germany was a little bit of an exceptional exercise, which had also very personal dimensions. And so, but I must say that throughout the study, we really looked eye to eye with regard to the politics, with regard to the scholarship we were reading, with regard to the interviews we were conducting. So just a couple of words about these 2 migrant communities that live in the city of Berlin. So Berlin is really the home to the largest Israeli and Palestinian communities in Germany, and to some extent within the context of Europe. There are roughly 30,000 Israelis living in the city and about twice as many Palestinians. For the most part, they arrive to the city under very different circumstances. The majority of the Palestinian community, which is of course not monolithic, and we show that very clearly in our book, that there are many different voices among Germans, among Palestinians, among Israelis, but the large majority came as refugees during the civil war in Lebanon, beginning in the late 70s and continuing throughout the 80s and 90s. And so the large majority is Muslim. There are some Christian Palestinians in Berlin, but most of them come from a refugee background. Most Israelis have come to the city as a result of economic reasons, personal reasons, romantic reasons. It is largely a more privileged community, so the asymmetry that we see in the Middle East is also to some extent duplicated within the context of Germany. We engaged several difficult topics, and I just want to mention a couple of them. They're especially sensitive within the German context. So one is bringing the Holocaust and the Nakba into dialogue. And those were, of course, questions we discussed with our interviewees. We also brought anti-Semitism and Islamophobia into dialogue. Again, a very complicated and sensitive subject in the German context. And another topic I wished we didn't have to also examine from a personal perspective is the question of censorship, the censorship especially of voices that are critical of Israel, especially Palestinians, and to some extent Muslims who live in Germany. And even though within the book itself, we don't bring in Saed's personal perspective on this in the concluding postscript, where both Saed and I reflect on our personal views on the study that we conducted. I did express my disappointment in the German public for not letting Saed speak at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. He was invited to give a talk at the Jewish Museum, and under pressure from the Israeli ambassador, he was uninvited, and this led to a large media campaign. And so for me, at the time, having a conversation with the director of the Jewish Museum, who himself, Peter Schäfer, is not Jewish, and I believe from his perspective, his career was really dedicated to making up for many of the atrocities committed during the Second World War. He had no other choice but to obey the orders of the Israeli ambassador. He shared with me that, well, I feel I really have no choice. I have no choice in acting with regard to this request from the Israeli ambassador. And for me, as the daughter of Holocaust survivors, this had a lot of weight. It didn't resonate very well. So there were many results to our study that we conducted, and I just want to highlight two of them. So largely Germans, we observed that Germans and Germany makes really sincere efforts to deal with the atrocities of the past, and they do take responsibility for the genocide more than any other European country, and they really sincerely try to make up for it. But there is this very blatant inability to extend the generosity that they extend to Jews, to Israelis, and Israelis towards Palestinians. I mean, they translate their Vergangenheitsbewältigung only to all Jews and Israelis, but not to Palestinians. And then another surprising result that I would like to mention here is the very different experience of anti-Semitism when we compare the German Jewish community to the Jewish Israeli community that lives in Berlin. And it shows that anti-Semitism, we all know that it is very difficult to measure in terms of numbers and to establish accurate statistics. This is a real problem. Not all anti-Semitic incidents are reported. Some incidents are verbal, others are physical. But it is also something that is very much an emotional experience, and it was very interesting for us to see that most German Jews feel that anti-Semitism is very prevalent, is a real threat to their existence in Germany, and it is something that really defines their identity very much. And it is something that keeps them busy, whereas Israelis who come to live in Germany and who come to live in Berlin, it is not something that is of concern. It's not something that they think about that defines their identity as Jews or as Israelis. So this was something that was very interesting. And perhaps just my own view on the larger question of this panel, I do believe that Germany does play a role in supporting Israel's action and policies towards Palestinians within Israel and beyond, and that given their mostly honorable attitude in taking responsibility towards the crimes committed during the Second World War, and also very laudable efforts with regards to their Vergangenheitsbewältigung, their efforts of coming to terms with a genocide, they should also be made accountable for supporting Israel's continued racism, discrimination, and violence against Palestinians. Their voice within the context of the EU and even within a more global context is not negligible. And Germany should not try to whitewash Israel's injustices and crimes with their guilt for the atrocities committed against Jews and other marginalized communities, assuming this position of blind support of the Zionist cause.
Thank you, Kati. I'll just say that if you have any questions in the audience, you can write in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to address them all in the discussion section of this webinar. And we move on to Yossi Bartal from Diaspora Alliance.
Hello, I'm Yossi Bartal. I'm not the co-director of Diaspora Alliance, thank God. I'm just responsible for research. It would be too much responsibility for me. And Diaspora Alliance is a new organization started last year as a coming out from many different organizations, especially from the Jewish left movements or from the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which was an effort to define anti-Semitism in a way that is not to be instrumentalized to silence Palestinians. So this is actually one of our main issues, right? Like in Germany, in the UK, in the US, how the discourse of anti-Semitism, how we can fight anti-Semitism as part of fighting racism, and in the same time fight the instrumentalization of anti-Semitism in service of right-wing politics. So I will dive just in. We spoke quite a lot about the political dimensions, and Katarina also spoke a little bit about the censorship that is going on. I would just say very shortly, because this is important for context, we do know of like many events being canceled in Germany for having Palestinians or pro-Palestinian speakers, or many events don't even happen. A lot of those cancellations don't happen publicly. And there is we didn't speak about that, how big is this feeling of like we cannot speak, we cannot be in public criticizing fundamentally Israeli policies. But this is, of course, a question that comes up for anyone who's active in the field. And I think it was quite interesting here. We also have people who were like in state, party foundations like the Heinrich Böll, in the Rosa Luxemburg, in others. It is something that comes up quite a lot, I think, in the daily work. What I'm going to talk about today is how protecting Israeli policies toward Palestinians became part of the fight against anti-Semitism in Germany, in institutional and legal way. What we see in Germany is, of course, not unique totally in the discourse created by Israel supporters around the world, right? So framing any form of anti-Zionism or even non-Zionism as anti-Semitic, but it is unique in Germany, the way that it is put into praxis and the way that it receives state resources and expands very drastically. This process was, of course, enabled by a vast and well-organized pro-Israel social movement in Germany, from Christian, evangelical, different groups that are doing it for religious reasons, from very mainstream forms of support to Israel to even left-wing. Like it's something that many, I think, people in the audience that are not well known in Germany, that is also there's even radical leftists, people who call themselves communists, who are very supportive of Israeli policies, then so-called anti-Germans. We would not go into that, but just saying it is in all political fields, there is a very big support for Israel to be found. So, of course, in this kind of like social movement, intellectual milieu, this already existed before. What we see in the recent years, especially since 2016, I would say, is how this force becomes a power inside the state, how it is being institutionalized and become a part of a bureaucracy. And reframing the main threat, or one of the main anti-Semitic threats, not coming from the inside of German society, from the neo-Nazi threat, but from Palestinians or post-colonial theorists or even leftist Israelis. So the first step in the process, and I'm very happy, Kari, that you talked about, was to define criticism of the state of Israel as an internal threat to Jewish communities inside Germany. So, of course, Jews do feel, and our feeling of like criticism of Israel also is a criticism of Jewish communities. There is a lot of research about it. This is sometimes this also come up as violent attacks on Jewish communities. So it is a fact. It does happen. The main challenge, though, to make it into the main issue is that actual police statistics are proving year after year that 80 to 90% of anti-Semitic crime comes from the extreme right. So in response to the 2014 military assault on Gaza and the mainly Palestinian demonstrations against Israel in Germany, and also the influx of refugees that came in 2015, many of them Palestinians, there was a new anti-Semitism monitor organization founded with a very clear pro-Israeli bias. And in recent years, they created their own statistics of anti-Semitic cases, criminal and non-criminal, that actively try to change the focus on the issue from a predominantly of anti-Semitism as a predominantly right-wing phenomena to include critics of Israel, including many Israeli Jews who dare criticize their country in Germany. So, for example, we have even a case of a lecture by an Israeli Holocaust historian defined as an anti-Semitic incident. because he was saying that also Israelis are not immune to the threats of fascism. The main target of the discourse yet are not Israeli Jews, but mainly Palestinians. And there's actually, in all of those statistics being published, I couldn't find a Palestinian demonstration that I knew about that was not there as an anti-Semitic incident, right? Like just saying Israel is an apartheid state is an anti-Semitic incident for this state-funded organization. So after reframing criticism of Israel as an internal threat to Jews, the next step was to pass also anti-BDS resolutions in local parliaments, in some places where there was never even one pro-Palestinian demonstration, right? Like towns, small places where there was never something against Israel, but they say no BDS in state, city-financed areas. Some of those local resolutions were not just about like we cannot host a BDS event, but also BDS supporters or people who might be close to BDS, or in Berlin, for example, people who are against Israel as a Jewish state, which actually would define many people in the Israeli left, right? Like people from Hadash or from Balad who are for a democratic, non-ethnic state. A very important aspect of those anti-BDS resolutions started on the local level, then going on the up level in the Bundestag, and it was put forward as an internal issue, so as a domestic issue. So German Jewish organizations were part of putting it on, and it was about threat to Jews in Germany. And actually, it's very interesting, like German experts, like the experts in the parliament about foreign policy, were not part of the discussion. It was, and that was one of the reasons that the anti-BDS resolution in the German Bundestag could pass so easily, the way it was. Also following this, with the BDS resolutions that came 2009, there was, of course, a year before, there was also the adoption of the IRA definition, the definition of anti-Semitism called IRA. This is something that is going on right now around the world. This is a very problematic definition that is being used to define criticism of Israel also as a form of anti-Semitism. We just saw, for example, Israeli state officials use it to define Breaking the Silence as an anti-Semitic organization. So this is this is a very problematic definition that is being circulated, and by its adoption, it gave, so to say, the moral support and the legal support to define any forms of harsh critiques of Israel as anti-Semitism. I'm getting close to that. So another part of this effort, so it's not just the legal forms that we're seeing, like as declarative laws or resolutions, it's also actually putting this inside state bureaucracy, and especially in the form of what we call in German Antisemitismusbeauftragten. It's one word, very long word, what anti-Semitism commissioners. And those anti-Semitism commissioners are actually all over the place in one way or another. So I just want to tell you how many there are, because there were none till 2018. So now we have, since 2018, we have a federal Antisemitismusbeauftragte, an anti-Semitism commissioner, Felix Klein. And then we have in 11 from 16 German states, someone who's anti-Semitism commissioner for that there are people that are like inside state institutions and are the ones who, would criticize an event that criticized Israel, or would call some artists that had signed a BDS petition to be disinvited, right? It's very important to say that all of those anti-Semitism commissioners are not Jewish, with the exception of one person who converted a year ago. So this is not a Jewish issue, right? It's always remember, it's a lot of those people who deal with anti-Semitism are not from the Jewish community. There is also anti-Semitism commissioners in local police. So trying to make police understand, when people say this or that in Palestinian demonstrations, this is anti-Semitism, or in anti-corona demonstrations as well. It's not just about that. So we have that. We also have police rabbis not for Jewish policemen that might need police rabbis, because there's no Jewish policemen in those states, as much as we know, but they are there to educate the police officers about anti-Semitism. By the way, we also have a military rabbinate, it's Rabbanut Tzva'it, in the German Bundeswehr since 2 years. Again, not for Jewish soldiers so much, because there are almost none, but also to fight anti-Semitism inside the German military. A lot of those fighting anti-Semitism, of course, also explain how good Israel is. We also have anti-Semitism commissioners in the Ministry of Culture. There's even one in the neighborhood in Berlin. There's one in the evangelical, like the Evangelische Kirche. There's much more important, there's tons of them in the state attorney departments, with the most fantastical number of 22 commissioners of anti-Semitism in North Rhine-Westphalia, in the state attorney. So to that, we also have anti-Semitism organizations, like a monitoring organization for anti-Semitism in almost every state in Germany, paid for by the local governments and by the federal government. So compared with similar initiatives and stuff to fight, for example, homophobia or racism, it is very clear that anti-Semitism is the main focus right now in state praxis. And this is a very, like, at least till now, and this is a very interesting thing to see how it inflated in very short time. So we're talking about really hundreds of people who work in this field who were not there before. So I'm trying to come to an end as fast as possible. There's also tries to put anti-Semitism in written law. So just to explain, usually anti-Semitism was understood as a form of racism. Now we have laws in Germany that put anti-Semitism next to racism, which could also be used later probably to criminalize criticism of Israel, if we understand anti-Semitism as harsh critique of Israel. And we've just now heard that someone would like to put migrants who want to become German citizens, that they have to go through an anti-Semitism test. So they would have to say that they support Israel's right to exist, for example. The interior ministers of Germany also wish to build a task force to coordinate the fight against anti-Israeli protests and ban Palestinian organizations, or maybe even the map of Palestine that doesn't show Israel on it. Of course, Israeli maps that do not show Palestine on it are not illegalized or should not be illegalized. And we already know of cases of Palestinians that were persecuted or under threat of deportation for just shouting in the demonstration, from the river to the sea, Palestine would be free or should be free. So as we see, there is a very big structure that is being created. Until now, some of the initiatives I discussed before, like the ban on BDS events, were declared unconstitutional by the court. Some other initiatives are being legally challenged as we speak. And the interesting thing, and I think this is also for people who don't know Germany as well, it's the Constitution of Germany, the Grundgesetz, which was written as a reaction to National Socialism and the horrors of the Holocaust, and is a very good tool to fight against racism and, of course, anti-Semitism, is still till today one of the main protectors of freedom of speech and the freedoms of criticizing human rights violation by Israel. How long would this liberal constitutional order could uphold the pressure from those unconstitutional efforts to illegalize Palestinian speech is we're going to see in the coming years, I would say. And it's upon us also to criticize it. So I hope I didn't take too much of your time.
Thank you so much, Yossi. This is a very detailed explanation of how this structure actually works. And just to remind again, when you're saying anti-Semitism, it's a very, very narrow definition of anti-Semitism. So all those commissioners, they only criticize one, or they only document what comes under this definition of anti-Semitism.
Yes, like I would just go into it's important to say that of course, there's a big focus, a much bigger focus on Israel criticism than there should be, as I see it. Of course, they are also talking about the Corona demonstrations. They're talking about neo-Nazis. They're talking about Islamist anti-Jewish hatred that has nothing to do with Palestine or very little. So it's not like only that, but of course, this is the focus, or I would say one of the main points of all of this.
Thank you, Yossi. We'll move on to Riyad Othman from Medico International. Please.
Thank you, Guy, and also Katharina for the invitation, and thanks to my predecessors with their contributions. A lot has been said already, so I'd like to focus on only a few more issues here. To begin with, I'd say we're not in a situation where you cannot criticize Israeli state policies in Germany. You can host an event on, say, settlement construction. You can do all these things. It's not that you will be kicked out of the venue that you've rented for this. I feel it's a lot more when when you're reflecting when it comes to how Israel as a state has to be seen, how the circumstances of its foundations have to be interpreted. Is it a necessary result of the Shoah, or is it also just one among other nationalisms, in this case Jewish nationalism, that can also be held to the same standards as we historically assess, politically assess other nationalist movements? And I feel it's a lot more about when the German official understanding of the state of Israel is questioned, that there's a very allergic and very drastic reaction to this. Having said that, I'd like to step back a little bit, because it's also interesting since Saad Akshan's and Katie's research goes back into those very years when first the German government endorsed the working definition of anti-Semitism of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and that which was in September 2017, and then a mere 4 months later, the German Bundestag came up with its own resolution regarding the matter, contributing also to setting the tone, what the most relevant danger, anti-Semitic danger to Jewish communities living in Germany was. And I'd like to still point out what Yossi has also said. I mean, there was already an imbalance when you looked at the IRA definitions examples, that the majority of which dealt with the state of Israel, with criticism of the state of Israel. But the German government, when they endorsed the definition, went one step further by inserting an additional sentence, which is not part of the actual international definition that everybody else has agreed to. They added the sentence, moreover, so maybe for those who are not familiar with the actual definition, here's the text of the actual definition, which reads, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals, that is, if they are perceived to be Jewish. That's my addition now. And all their property toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities, which is the very open and wide IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And then the German government decided to add the following sentence. Moreover, the state of Israel can also be the target of such attacks, then understood as a Jewish collective. So the imbalance that was already given in the examples that are not part of the definition was strengthened by the endorsement of the German government, and we see something similar happening in the parliamentary resolution at federal level in January 2018, when they explicitly welcomed the so-called extended version of the IRA definition, meaning endorsing also that focus on the state of Israel rather than the Jewish community, which also manifests, by the way, in the commitment that is towards Jews living in Germany and the state of Israel. As if due to Nazism in the 1930s, emigration had only happened to back then mandatory Palestine, which is just contrafactual. A lot of the forced Jewish immigration from Europe happened also to North America or Australia or South America, but there's no commitment to the descendants of those survivors of German atrocities and mass murder. The last point maybe that I'd like to make is, since Yossi also referred to those various resolutions that have been taken by a variety of bodies, in fact, partly, as you said, Yossi, as, say, resolutions that would generally set or make clear the commitment to fight anti-Semitism, partly basically a commitment to fight the boycott movement, BDS, very often kind of mixing both of them, defining BDS as anti-Semitic per se. And the tone for the debate, and this is a funny thing because obviously BDS is mostly a movement. First of all, it's very irrelevant in Germany. It's not really a political force here. It's an irrelevant factor in German politics. And that makes it look a bit funny when there's such a strong focus on BDS. The other thing is that, of course, I'd say it's mainly a thing among migrant communities who do have a Palestinian or Lebanese or Syrian or generally Arab or other migrant background. And even though the German parliament in its resolution in one sentence said that most crimes are committed out of a motivation that is right-wing extremist, but then they continued to state that basically dedicating hold on a second. Yeah, they continued to say that there is an increase in anti-Semitism through immigration from, and I quote, countries in North Africa, the Near and Middle East, in which anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel have a particularly fertile ground. And although acknowledging that the majority of anti-Semitic hate crime in Germany is committed by right-wingers, they dedicate a whole paragraph thereafter to the problem of immigration, setting the tone. And I want to quote again, anyone who enters the territory of the Federal Republic of Germany enters the grounds of the basic law. Mind you, there's no constitution in Germany, similarity to Israel. Any attempt to question the dignity of a person of the Jewish faith, and again, it points to a problem that the relationship to Jews is so complicated and tense that the parliament cannot even write Jews. It has to be a Jewish person of the Jewish faith. So any attempt to question the dignity of the person of the Jewish faith calls into question the liberal polity of our country as a whole and will not be tolerated by us. Therefore, our requirements for the integration of immigrants must also be directed towards making clear our country's special responsibility towards Jews in Germany and the State of Israel. The unrestricted acceptance of Jewish life is a yardstick for successful integration. Anyone who rejects Jewish life in Germany or questions Israel's right to exist will meet with our resolute resistance. And this basically set the tone for many a debate that was to come after that, be it around, say, the Cameroonian, South Africa-based philosopher Akil Mbembe, who was supposed to speak at a festival in Germany, be it about the firing of TV presenter of Palestinian origin, Nemi Al-Hassan, or the interventions even by Israeli and Jewish voices, to which Felix Klein, the federal commissioner, said that these people would have to understand that the tone in Germany is different. Debates here are different from what you can say in Israel. Or the firing of TV presenter Matondo Castlo, who had participated in a secular non-violent festival in the occupied West Bank in Farha, and who was then basically, as a result of this engagement, he was fired from his job as a presenter of a children's format. And all these resolutions on the fight against anti-Semitism, often naming the boycott movement BDS as anti-Semitic per se, or identifying action against this BDS movement as one of the most burning issues to combat threats to Jewish life in Germany. All this has basically resulted in various resolutions, as I said. You have them at municipal level, be it Munich, Frankfurt, Leipzig, Essen, Dortmund, and others. You have it at state level, say in North Rhine-Westphalia, in Thuringia, you have them in Berlin, you have them in the very southwest in Baden-Württemberg. You have them, as I said, at the federal level, parliamentary resolution, and you have them at the institutional level by a variety of bodies, be it the youth wings of Social Democratic Party branches, Green Party, you have it across the board politically speaking, and of course by professional bodies like trade unions, like the German Conference of High School Directors. And in all of this, you can identify a very, very strong focus on the State of Israel, and maybe what I would call a tragic lack of focus on prevalent anti-Semitism that's been here for many, many decades, and certainly before immigration became an issue for a very white Germany. And I'd end it here. Thanks.
Thank you, Riyad. Thank you all for these eye-opening presentations, really. And I think you covered a lot of the different aspects of this phenomenon that we are discussing. It's worth noting that key tension in these relations between Germany and Israel is that while Germany is shy to advance criticism of Israel's crime against Palestinians, it is a major donor to Palestinian civil society and to Palestinian Authority. So we need to think about all these ambivalence in one kind of shot. We don't have much time for an open conversation. We have 30 minutes, so I'll just maybe ask a couple of quick questions, and please try to answer shortly, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. So one question is about, I think it really relates to what Riyad just said about how migration is also, in a way, put in this context of anti-Semitism. And I want to ask, how does the German approach to anti-Semitism plays into race relations and to the German policies towards migrants? We know that in other contexts, like Riyad and others mentioned, there's a very different approach to anti-Semitism that comes from the right wing white Germans, or in the US or UK, you can see that as well, and from anti-Semitism that comes from people of color, migrants, etc. So if you have any inputs on that, that would be, you can just chime in.
Yeah, maybe just a brief sentence about it. Yeah, I think that it can be the case that fighting anti-Semitism in Germany then is not only about protecting the Jewish communities, but it is instrumentalized in many ways. We spoke about different ways it is instrumentalized, and it can also be instrumentalized as a criterion for excluding minorities and migrants who do not fit into this ideal German society. And these are arguments not coming only from the right wing. If we look, we also have proposals coming from the Liberal Party linking German citizenship to a commitment to anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism, and saying, okay, we can't give German citizenship to Syrian migrants or others because that might be too dangerous, and solidarity with Israel is needed also to prevent a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Germany. In that case, you have this link also to giving citizenship to migrants, and I think it's one aspect and a very dangerous argument.
Yes, Kati, please.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any recent study that was conducted among refugees to measure their level of anti-Semitism, but I remember at the time when we were collecting the data for our co-authored book, there were some efforts to try to measure the levels of anti-Semitism among refugee populations, and these studies actually confirmed that most of the incidents came from right-wing white German movements. And I wanted to bring into this discussion also the question of wanting to separate discussions of anti-Semitism from other forms of racism. And I do think that is a problem, especially when we think that the incidence of Islamophobia attacks, verbal and physical, against Muslim communities are much higher in terms of numbers. The community itself is also much larger. But as far as I know, even though the government, following the incident in Hanau, I believe it was, the government decided to institute a task force that will try to observe and counter these these incidents in the German realm. And as far as I know, nothing has really happened.
Yossi, Riyad, do you want to address that question?
They gave a very good answer already. I think it's
Okay, great. So now I'd want your input on the next question. As Yossi said, in many meetings that I had with German officials, I was told that Israel is a domestic issue in Germany. And what does it mean when we speak about German foreign policy, and what does it mean for Israel actual foreign policy, and what does it mean for Palestinians and Israelis living in Germany, which is supposedly a domestic issue? And maybe Riyad and Yossi, you can also speak about trying to do advocacy work when you are dealing with a domestic issue that's allegedly sitting within the foreign ministry responsibility.
Maybe I just one little thing that I think that is quite interesting with the domestic issue, because now I will speak from Berlin because Berlin is a specific area. We have around, it's hard to say, but probably at least 15,000 Israelis in Berlin. And I would consider most of them to be probably Labor Meretz voter, if not Hadash voters. Usually very few Bibi supporters, let's say like this. And we're waiting more to come. There's actually more Israelis in Berlin than there are Jewish members of the community in Berlin. Yet those Israelis are not part of the discussions on anti-Semitism. Those Israelis are not even part of, we don't have any representation, right? The Jewish community is organized. So it's like, oh, we have someone from the Jewish community to speak about, they're actually representing a minority of Jews in Berlin. So sometimes with this idea of even in the domestic issue, especially when it comes Israel-related anti-Semitism, who is affected by Israel-related anti-Semitism if not Israelis, like me? I have an Israeli name, I have an Israeli accent. If people really hate Israel, they'll probably, go to me before they go to some Jewish person that is not Israeli. And yet we are not part of the discussion. And we know why we are not part of the discussion, right? It's because most of us are liberals to left-wing. So I think this is one of the funny thing with this domestic issues. How do we react to it? Is to say, okay, if it is a domestic issue, so try to actually speak with member of the Jewish community who have different positions to it. And of course, speak with Palestinians who are a very big ethnic minority in Berlin. And we always have to think about them as part of our policies. And that those policies are, at least, even if they're not thought of as racist, they are targeting an ethnic minority in Germany much more than any other ethnic minority. So we cannot have these discussions without bringing them into the table. So this is what we are trying to move in this domestic debate. More Israeli and more Palestinian participation.
Yeah, I would maybe try to add something to this. So in a way, I feel it is domestic. I mean, from on the various aspects. I mean, one thing, and I think it was Stefan who said it in the beginning, good relations to the state of Israel are very, very important for German well-being, for feeling okay, for feeling we are doing enough against anti-Semitism. We have been accepted as one democracy among others. Talking about Germany now. And the other point where this issue becomes very domestic is increasingly from as I tried to point out or mentioned on the sidelines, from a law and order perspective. Public peace, public order. Who's coming here, who sets foot on German soil, sets foot on the grounds of our basic law. There are certain values that we have to share. And if you don't accept those values, or if you don't accept the way that the official German governmental position is towards the state of Israel, then you basically cannot be part of this collective. You cannot be part of this society. And we saw this very clearly during, I think it was in 2010 21 during protests when there was another escalation on Gaza, and there were protests in Berlin when the Federal Anti-Semitism Commissioner said people should not be so emotional. The protests are so emotional. Why don't people go out and protest orderly? Why don't they? And they did. They registered their protests, and some of those protests were anti-Semitic. I agree with this because, I mean, what we saw were protesters in other cities they went to protest in front of a synagogue, which is, of course, you cannot hold Jews responsible. You cannot hold them accountable for actions that the state of Israel is committing or that its army is committing. But what happened in the German media was a blanket labeling of any protest as anti-Semitic, while people did exactly what Felix Klein, as anti-Semitism commissioner, had asked them to do. They had registered protests and they tried to make use of their basic rights to protest. And still, this wasn't good enough because it was too emotional, or as then a leading Green Party politician nowadays, he's a minister in the German government, as he said in front of the Brandenburger Tor here in Berlin, there will only be peace when the Arabs love their children more than they hate us, the Israelis, the Jews. He allegedly quoted Golda Meir, because I think originally the quote is not hers, but this is kind of the discourse that I think remains largely exclusive. If you don't accept unconditionally certain positions and you negate your own, say, your family history, your family biography, your own history of having experienced violence also, then you can't be part of this collective.
Thank you. I'll just say that I understand that the chat is disabled, so please use the Q&A section function on your Zoom interface. It's right next to the raise hand logo, and those of you who raise their hands, there is no option of us letting you speak because it's a webinar format. So please type your questions. Please, Stefan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, Yossi mentioned the anti-BDS resolution already, and that was where you could see that in most parties, politicians from the foreign policy circles opposed this resolution. But it was perceived as a domestic issue, and because of that, there was a huge majority for this resolution. And at the political level, it can be really, as a politician, it can be very costly to challenge this discourse of special relationship. And there are very little political gains to do so. Yeah. And additionally, this whole term of a Staatsräson also constrains the discourse, because it doesn't allow for a discourse discussing also what does support for Israel's security actually mean. And I mean, if you read the letter from the Universal Fund now circulated and signed by many, they exactly say, well, this is a threat to this government is a threat to Israeli democracy, but it's also a threat to security in the region for Israelis and Palestinians. So if you, Germany, if you want to secure Israel, the existence and let them have people live here in this area a safe life, then we have to really discuss what does it mean, security here, and again, also not talking about it or just ritualizing it is also having a political effect. It is giving legitimacy to this government, and it doesn't hold this government accountable. And I think it's also important to remember that this is not only about an internal issue in Israel, but this is clearly connected to the conflict, to the occupied territories. And this is a foreign policy issue, and it also has to be discussed as a foreign policy issue.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm going to need one of the Germans' help to read part of this question. A person named Michael asked, how important is the identification with Israel as a word in German that I cannot read?
Ersatznationalismus. Ersatznationalism. I think you say Ersatznationalism is where it's how do you say ersatz in English?
Compensatory, or like something like this.
Yeah.
Compensation.
Substitute.
Yeah, substitute. Yeah, would be the best word.
Okay, so
I have a very short. I don't think it's substitutes. It's part of it. It's German nationalism can be reinforced. Of course, you have people who say, especially from the radical left, those anti-Germans that are a specific historical phenomena that we would not talk about today. You can see that there, that it's supporting Israel instead of supporting any other form of nationalism. But I think for most Germans that support Israel, it is part of they love Germany through German support to Israel. They become, their nationalism is being gets a kosher stempel, right? So through the love of Israel. So that's how I would answer it.
If there are any more answers to this question, I can move on to the next one. I see that Dr. Muriel Asberg asked about approaches, how we address this issue, do we move on from here? How do we maybe broaden the spaces of criticism of Israel in German public debate and in German politics? Yes, Kati.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking we may actually be able to respond to also the next question, which comes from an anonymous attendee. Do you think the media and the way they portray the conflict plays a bigger role in general? And I think media is, I actually think, yes, media does play a big role in how the situation is portrayed. And I think a lot could be done in this regard to help Germans understand the situation better. And and I think the tweet, that was it a newspaper article that you read at the very beginning, Katharina, by an Israeli Berliner, I assume. So I have observed over the last few years that there is a tendency to include more articles by Israelis who live in Berlin. And I think that's a good move. And I think the reason is that there is, I think most Israelis are more daring when they talk about Israeli human injustices and violence, and the occupation and racism and apartheid, and that German journalists could probably, most of them, lose their job if they spoke up as Israelis. But even with regard to Israelis, I had conversations with German journalists who told me that they're not able to just publish any Israeli who is critical of Israel. It depends. There's a limit even in the media, and that's something that one should try to change. That media should be a more open forum to criticize Israel.
Thank you, Kati. There's a question by Verena about how this approach to BDS and anti-Semitism may let radical right ideologies kind of enter again into German politics, if that's a risk do you consider something we should be worried about?
I'd say, I'm just going to say a few things on this. I think, of course, one has to be worried about this, but this is not first of all, it's not a phenomenon that's only happening in Germany. Second of all, it's not a phenomenon related to Israel mainly or exclusively. I'd say that the attraction that AfD or Orban's party in Hungary, Fidesz, if I'm not mistaken, or other nationalistic parties feel is that, say, certain political forces in Israel, certainly Likud, but now also the ones more to the right, have very openly pursued an ethno-religious state, an ethno-religious society that has not been that hasn't been promoted in that way, say in democracies in Europe, that weren't acceptable in democracies in Europe. And in that respect, I think Israel or Israeli politics serves as a role model for many in the so-called new right. But it's not that Israel has invented these policies. It's more like, okay, if we align to, say, Israeli politicians or Israeli parties, that can earn us a waiver on anti-Semitism, because if we are close to Israel as a Jewish state, leave out the democratic part because I don't think they care very much about this. But if we are close to the Jewish state, how can we be anti-Semites at home? So there is a double benefit from this, and you can be largely and openly anti-immigration, because that's part of the fight against anti-Semitism, and who wouldn't understand that?
I just wanted to add something on something that I think is also important, coming back that this also is a foreign policy issue. Actually, I joined a discussion yesterday about democratic backsliding in Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, and lessons to be learned for Germany. And one important message from someone from Hungary was that the European Union actually, the argument was, enabled this democratic backsliding because for a long time they closed their eyes and continued supporting Hungary, and only very late this conditionality clause was introduced. So how you react as a partner is very important, and especially, I mean, if you define this relationship also as a friendship, then Israelis here claim, so if you're a true friend, then we have to openly discuss and openly criticize also, and to be really interested in the other, which means it's not about an image that serves German self-image or German interests, but it's really looking at what is happening here in Israel. And a lot of people here in the demonstrations fear that this is not happening, and that Germany is not showing solidarity with the protests here.
Yes, Yossi?
I wanted to say one thing, maybe because we're getting close to the end, and like how to go forward. I want to say something more to the Israelis here that are listening. And I think for us as Israeli Jews who grew up in Israel, the question of anti-Semitism is always very problematic because we didn't experience anti-Semitism growing up, and we do come to Jewish communities around the world. We usually it understood that like they have the right to define for themselves what is anti-Semitism, and rightly so most of the times. The thing is, the way that this issue was politicized in recent years, the way that every form of Palestinian resistance to the occupation or to the apartheid policies is being redefined as a form of anti-Semitism is boomeranging also toward Israelis and forces in Israel fighting for human rights. And this is something that, most of people in Israel, Palestine, think that anti-Semitism is not an issue they should care about. We know that it's being used by the right, and I really would recommend most people here who are part of the left in Israel, Palestine, part of liberal circles, to know how this issue is being instrumentalized not only inside Israel discourse but outside, and to vocally oppose this, because if anti-Semitism is defined as Palestinian resistance to the occupation, this is going, and it does come back to Israel-Palestine. It means that Palestinians are being demonized. It means that we have no way of thinking of a shared future with Palestinians, if they are anyway anti-Semitic, right? Because for no reason, they just hate Jews. So if we don't disturb this kind of discourse, we have a problem also here in the Holy Land. So that would be my appeal on Israelis.
Okay, so just before we move on to Katarina's conclusion, there's a question from Astrid Wortmann about the risks to German liberal open democracy. And I think if we also think about Germany also as it considers itself as a center for global culture, and we saw the aftermath of the Documenta attack on the artists participating in this maybe one of the most important global events, art events that happens in Germany. Do we see a backlash coming when these limitations in Germany might be seen very badly, both by Germans, and maybe we could see like people going to the other direction, or by international communities such as artists, authors, academics, considering Germany as a place they cannot go to and have the ability to practice their free speech?
Well, I'd say obviously. I mean, when those a group of very important German institutions came out to criticize the anti-BDS resolution without themselves being pro-BDS, but what they were basically backed up by another public letter that was signed by, I think, 1,200 artists and researchers, scholars, etc., authors, poets, painters, what have you not, from all over the world, who clearly saw that who clearly saw German discourse as actually stifling their free speech and also the freedom of the arts, the freedom of the freedom of science, and I think where Germany, if it continues down that path, can of course expect that less and less people will be willing, especially from places from the so-called global South, will be willing to come to Germany if, say, their views on Israel are dictated by the German host, or say their views on Russia as we have it, because you may or may not be aware of this, but for many in African, Asian, Latin American countries, and we may like this or may not like this, we may disagree with them or agree with them, but they hold different views on what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territory, etc., etc. And if we just say you can come here, but only under the condition A, B, C, if you see Israel exactly as we want you to see it, as the German as German official discourse sees it, and under any other circumstances you will be seen as an anti-Semite and will not be welcome, then I think we shouldn't be surprised if some people choose not to come here and not to engage, not because they're anti-Semites, but because there's no room for a discussion left.
Please, Kati.
Yeah, I also want to add something, and that includes even Jewish Israeli voices who are critical of Israel, who are increasingly referred to as anti-Semitic, and in the context of the art scene in Germany, in the space for Jewish artists or Israeli artists to be critical of Israel, there's this most recent incident of the Jewish photographer Adam Brumberg for describing Israel policies and actions in the occupied Palestinian territories as an apartheid system, and who was, reprimanded by the Hamburg Anti-Semitism Commissioner Stefan Hensel. And he then responded by saying, I can't believe I'm the son of Holocaust survivors, and I'm critical of the Israeli apartheid system.
So thank you, everyone. I think it was an amazing 1.5 hours, and it simply showed us how timely this discussion was. Although, as I said in the beginning, when Guy and me, we were thinking about this webinar, we didn't thought it would be that timely by today. I would like to give a quick conclusion, also going through what our speakers contributed. So Stefan, you emphasized, of course, that this is a special relationship, but you also underlined the asymmetric of this relationship, which I think is really also a lot of what we were talking about today, and also like the differentiation between, of course, the of the officials and politics and the German public. Whereas Katharina presented this amazing results of the book with Said that targets exactly this question, right? The moral triangle, like what is this constellation, German, Israeli, Palestinians? What does this mean? What kind of responsibility Germans carry towards Israelis, towards Jewish people, but also towards the Palestinian people? And I think also this kind of results about accountability and how it's divided, and how kind of Germany is hiding for his responsibility towards the Palestinians behind, like saying, okay, but we are protecting Israel, or we connecting Judaism to the Israeli state, is something that was very much outlined also in this book. Also, Yossi and Riyad, you focused on this kind of alignment that is very special for the German case, that anti-Semitism is so closely connected with the state of Israel, or anti-Zionism, saying that every criticism towards Israel is very, very quickly labeled as anti-Semitism, whereas we say often in Germany, the police or also the army is very blind on the right eye, but very aware on the left eye. So saying, okay, anything that is anti-Israeli is anti-Semitic. But in the same time, Katharina also spoke about the attack of Hanau, that took a long, long time to find the people who were in charge of it, to figure out that was a right-wing cell. And you also underlined it, that 80% of anti-Semitic attacks in Germany are conducted by neo-Nazis or right-wingers, and that this is something that is completely left out of the focus. So when we were preparing for this webinar, what I was thinking a lot as a German is kind of the perspective of Germany and the German past. A very new debate in Germany is currently the debate of German colonies, German colonialism. It's also something that Germany never really dealt with. It's just coming out now to say, okay, what's the compensation for the people in Namibia, or what was happened in the so-called German Africa, like the crimes that the Germans conducted there, and crimes that are also very much connected to the aftermath, to the following Nazi times. A lot of tactics that were used there, a lot of examinations that were done on the local population were afterwards also used by the Nazis. So also this interconnection is very often not seen in German history or in reflection. So it gives a little bit of this taste, what also Katharina said in the end, like we try to whitewash German history through commemorating the Holocaust and the Shoah, which is crucial and very important. But the German memory stops there. It doesn't go more backwards, not talking about colonialism, and it doesn't go more forwards than talking also what happened when the state of Israel was established. We have also to talk about the Nakba, because in a way, the Nakba is interrelated to what Germany did before. So like, where is the space for this? We are also having on the 15th of May, the 75th anniversary of the Nakba memory. Last year in Berlin, when there were held memorial demonstrations for this event, a lot of people were arrested. The Berlin police was very brutal, and also, like, by now we know, also instructed to explicitly silence these voices and arrested a lot of people that are now going into court. What I saw in the chat of the webinar were people asking, so, okay, how do we target this issue? What comes from here? And I think Stefan in the beginning concluded his statement with saying, this could also be an opportunity. I think what we are going through now, like also having a very right-wing fascist government that is democratic elected, of course, but it is a right-wing government. And going through this special friendship where we say, okay, we have this special relation. So we as a German public audience, politicians can speak out, and we are carrying the responsibility for the Holocaust. So this is why we even have to speak more out against further crimes, against further massacres, against further pogroms. So I think if we want to kind of conclude on a positive note or see what can be done, I think it's very much up to the German public to change a mindset and to acknowledge that our responsibility as this special friend goes far beyond, that we have to deal with what is currently happening in Israel and also to confront. And this has also kind of done to be promoted towards politicians. And I think the work of NGOs on the ground, like we had Riyad here from Medico, we had Stefan here from the Heinrich Böll Foundation, is very important on this. And I have like a big hope that we are reaching this kind of true friendship where we can really talk and confront and be very explicit about what is going on. Also, especially like as a German and with the German history. So I would like to thank you very much for joining this webinar. And I think we have already an idea for a second one, which will be like how to go from there and how can we convert this friendship in a proper and honest one. So thank you very much, and I hope I see you all soon again.